The silence had been like this for 4 months now. Not empty silence. The manor was never truly empty. Not with the portraits still watching from their gilt frames, and the house elves moving in the walls like a heartbeat that could be felt more than heard. But a silence of reduced weight. A silence of missing presence. Of rooms that no longer served the purposes they were designed to serve. Lucius had been in Azkaban since June. Narcissa had not yet found the right shape in which to hold that fact. She stood at the window of the drawing room, looking out at the Wiltshire grounds. October had stripped the garden of almost everything worth looking at. The topiary along the south wall stood in dark, clipped shapes against a sky the colour of old pewter. The ornamental pond had not been cleaned. It sat brown and matted under a crust of fallen leaves. She should have told the house elves to see to it weeks ago. She had not, and she found she could not make herself care about any of it with the particular urgency that used to come so easily when this had been a house rather than a monument to an arrangement that no longer held. What kept her at the window was calculation. She had always believed this was what composure actually was, not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of routing feeling away from the face and into something useful. She was calculating. She was waiting for the next thing to land. It landed at 2:30 in the afternoon, when a house elf brought her the evening edition folded over a silver tray. She had seen the headline before she touched the paper. She read it twice, standing at the window with the grey garden at her back. A Hogwarts student had been found cursed on the road from Hogsmeade. A girl, a Gryffindor, a name she did not recognise. Severe injury. Taken to St. Mungo's. The ministry had been informed. Security under review. Narcissa set the paper down on the window seat. She stood very still. This was a practiced stillness, the kind that could be sustained for quite a long time, and she sustained it now while she let herself understand what she had just read. She did not feel anything about the girl. This was not cruelty. She simply had no architecture left for other people's children. Every last resource had been rerouted, and had been since August, and the girl's name might as well have been an address in a country she had never visited. What moved through her chest was something entirely different. Something with the slow, leaden weight of a fact that had been trying to arrive for months. This was his work. The cursed necklace, the Hogsmeade Road, the student now lying at St. Mungo's with healers clustered around her. All of it was Draco's work, and all of it had failed. And Dumbledore would know. He had probably already known before the first edition had been printed. She thought about the last time she had seen her son. The end of August. The light that morning had been good, one of the last truly warm mornings before autumn, and she had looked at him in it and tried to memorize what she was looking at, because some part of her, the part she kept furthest from her voice, had understood she might be memorizing a final version. His face had been wrong in a way she could not name at first. Pale had always been his natural state. He was a Malfoy. They were all pale. It meant nothing. But this was different. Grey, actually grey. The colour of exhaustion, pressed so deep it had become the skin rather than a shadow on it. Dark rings beneath his eyes that had not been there at Christmas. The sharp line of his jaw where there had been roundness the previous year. 16 years old, and already his body was telling on him. She had embraced him in the entrance hall and felt how thin he was through his robes. She had said nothing that she actually wanted to say. This, too, was composure. You carried the things that could not be said in a place beneath the words you actually spoke, and you did not let the one contaminate the other, and you went on. She had gone on. For 2 months she had gone on, managing the manor and Bellatrix's visits and the daily work of maintaining the appearance of a household functioning normally, while its central structures had all been quietly dismantled. She had written to Draco once a week. His replies came shorter each time, less of his actual voice in them, more of the flat courtesy of someone reporting in rather than communicating. She thought about the unbreakable vow. Snape was bound to watch over Draco, to protect him, to complete his task, if Draco could not. She had stood in that dark, low-ceilinged room with Bellatrix's hands around hers, and she had asked for 3 promises, and he had given them, and the fire had sealed everything closed. She should have felt something like relief when she walked back out into the cold street. She had felt only the specific nausea of a person who has done everything correctly and knows it will not be enough. The vow protected Draco from one category of failure. It said nothing about the ministry deciding to investigate, nothing about a public inquiry, an expulsion, a formal accusation that could not be managed quietly from inside the school. Snape could be watching over Draco at this very moment, faithful to every term of what had been promised, and still be powerless to prevent the world pressing in from outside. Albus Dumbledore would know. This was the fact she kept returning to, the fact that had been orbiting her composure for months, without ever quite breaking through it. Dumbledore knew things he should not know. It was not magic, and it was not luck. It was some quality of attention, relentless and patient, that gathered information the way cold gathered in old stone. Pervasive, unhurried, occupying every available gap. He already knew Draco was behind it. He had known, she suspected, since before the girl was cursed, and he had not acted. This was the part she could not decipher. Not yet. It was the part that unsettled her more than any explanation she could invent, because she could not fill a gap with a reason she could not name. He knew, and he had chosen to wait, and she could not read what he was waiting for. She had spent 4 months standing at windows, thinking carefully, doing nothing. Composure had been the right instrument for 4 months. It was no longer the right instrument. There was a girl at St. Mungo's. There would be a ministry inquiry. There would be questions asked about Hogwarts students and the Hogsmeade Road and the source of a cursed opal necklace, and every question led to the same answer. And Draco was 16 and grey and already carrying more than he had the body for. She would go to Hogwarts. She would go to the headmaster's office, and she would face Albus Dumbledore directly, and she would look at him across his desk and determine what it was he was waiting for. Not to negotiate. She was not naive enough to imagine she could negotiate anything. But to know. To be present rather than absent, active rather than managed, a person who had chosen to look rather than one who waited to be told. She did not tell anyone. She left no note. She moved through the manor with the unhurried precision that was second nature to her now, gathered what she needed, and did not look back at the portraits in their frames or the silver tray still sitting where the house elf had left it. The grounds were the colour of tarnished metal when she stepped outside. The ornamental pond sat thick with leaves. The topiary stood in its dark shapes along the south wall, clipped and neat and entirely indifferent to what she was about to do. Bellatrix would find out. She always found out. There would be a reckoning, and Narcissa would manage it with the same precision she brought to everything her sister required of her. But Bellatrix would find out after. She left through the gates without looking back at the house. The clock was the first thing she checked every morning. Not the kitchen clock above the fireplace, which only told the hour. The family clock, old and round and deeply impractical by any standard, that didn't account for the specific anxiety of being mother to 7, hung near the back door on its particular nail, and she had developed the habit so long ago she no longer thought of it as a habit. She just looked. 9 hands. 9 small painted faces that had always seemed to her more accurate likenesses than any formal portrait could manage. Ron's was a little lopsided, which was right. Fred and George's were identical, which she had always privately found funny. She had never told them she could tell which was which. This morning the kitchen was barely warm. She'd come down early, her dressing gown pulled close, the tiles cold through her slippers. The garden outside the window was grey and damp. Autumn had come properly now. There were gnomes huddled in the vegetable bed, and the pond at the bottom of the garden was covered in a thin skin of fallen leaves. She stood in front of the clock in the half-dark and did her counting. Arthur, home. She could hear him upstairs, the soft creak of the floorboard by the wardrobe that meant he was getting dressed. Bill, work. Charlie, travelling. Fred, home. George, home. Both in the flat above the Diagon Alley shop now, and she was glad for it, and she missed them in a way she hadn't quite anticipated she would. Ron, school. The hand was steady, pointing without apology, and she let herself feel what she always felt when she looked at it, the cold, quiet relief of a fact. He was there. He was located. Ginny, school. Same. She was there. Harry, school. He had been on the clock since the summer before her son's 2nd year, when it had simply added itself to the 9 already there, and she had stopped finding that strange a long time ago. Percy. Work. She held his face in her gaze for a moment, the small painted image of her 3rd son, slightly severe even at this scale, and then she went to put the kettle on. This was the rhythm of it. She had learned that you could not stand in front of his hand and feel the full weight of what it meant, not every morning, not if you also needed to function. So she looked, and she registered, and then she moved. The ministry was where Percy pointed, not home, not here. The clock had no hand for estrangement, no position called gone but alive but absent, and it is his own choosing. Work was the closest approximation the clock could manage, and she had decided months ago that she would treat it as enough. Arthur came downstairs while the water was heating. He was in his dressing gown, hair still flattened from sleep on the left side, and he moved through the kitchen the way he always had, slightly distracted, slightly delighted by whatever he happened to think of on the way across the room, reaching past her for a mug with the automatic ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She saw his forearm when he reached. The scar ran from wrist to elbow on the inside of his arm, long and ridged and pale against his skin, and she had stopped flinching at the sight of it sometime in the spring. She did not flinch at it now. She was simply aware of it, the way you were aware of furniture you had lived with long enough to stop seeing clearly. December 1995. She had spent 3 days at St. Mungo's and gone home only to sleep and come back, and the healer had told her there was no antidote to serpent venom of that magnitude except time and luck, and Molly had understood in those 3 days what the word lucky actually meant when you applied it to a person rather than a circumstance. He was recovered. He was here. He was reaching past her for a mug. She handed it to him before he could knock something off the shelf. The post arrived while she was frying eggs. She had the plate half assembled when she saw the article, buried on the 3rd page as though it were an ordinary piece of news. A Hogwarts student had been found unconscious on the road from Hogsmeade. A cursed object. St. Mungo's. Ministry inquiry. Student's condition serious. Molly set the pan down. She read it again carefully. She read the phrase cursed object twice, and then the word serious, and she thought about a child, some girl. The paper gave a name she would commit to memory because she was the kind of person who did that, lying in a ward at St. Mungo's while the ministry sent memos around and Hogwarts reviewed its security protocols in language that did not sound like anyone's son or daughter in it at all. She thought about Ron walking that road. She thought about Ginny, who would be old enough for Hogsmeade visits next year. Her boggart surfaced before she could stop it, not the thing itself. She was in her own kitchen, and there were no boggarts here. But the memory of it was almost as bad. She had walked into the drawing room at Grimmauld Place the summer before last, with a doxy net in one hand and no warning, and then the shape of it had come together in front of her, and she had stood there shaking while the faces came one by one. Arthur, Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny, Harry. Each face arranged in the particular stillness that meant there was nothing left behind it. She had known this was possible long before she had the clock with 9 hands, or the 7 children who needed to be on it. She had known since Fabian and Gideon, since a Tuesday morning in what felt like a different world, since she had stood in her mother's kitchen and understood that 5 Death Eaters was a number, and her brothers were not a number. She had been holding this knowledge for 15 years now, the knowledge that the worst thing could happen because the worst thing had happened, and most days she was able to keep it below the surface, where it belonged, where it could not touch the eggs she was frying, and the tea she was handing to Arthur, and the ordinary morning going on around her. She turned the eggs. She finished the plates. She brought them to the table and sat down. There was an article, she said. A student at Hogwarts was cursed on the Hogsmeade Road. She's at St. Mungo's. Arthur looked up from his tea. He was watching her the way he watched her when he had already read the situation and was deciding what she needed from him. I saw. Ron and Ginny are in that school, she said. Not as an argument, just as a fact that needed to be said out loud, because some things needed the air to feel real. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Are you going to go? Yes. She had decided before she sat down. She understood this now. I'm going to see Dumbledore. He needs to know that the families know about this. He needs to understand what it means for the children at that school when a cursed object can reach a student on a public road. She did not add, and I need to look him in the eye and know he has it in hand, because I cannot keep a grip on myself from a distance, and the boggart memory is too close this morning. She did not add that, because Arthur already knew it, and because some things were just true without needing to be spoken to the person who had been listening to you for 26 years. I'll be back by evening, she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She felt the faint ridging of the scar on his forearm against the back of her fingers. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment, and then she stood up and began to clear the plates, and she was already thinking about what she wanted to say to Albus Dumbledore by the time the water was running. She had been a student here once. Narcissa did not think about that often. It was not a useful thing to think about, and she had always preferred to think about useful things. But walking the castle's corridors now, the stone cold under her feet, and the portraits watching from their frames, with the incurious patience of people who had watched a great deal over a very long time, she found the memory of it pressing in at the edges. The particular quality of Hogwarts in the afternoon. Something that was not quite a smell and not quite a sound, more a quality of the air itself, as though the castle breathed at a frequency slightly slower than the outside world, and you had to adjust to it, or be quietly, persistently unsettled. She was not unsettled. She was composed. She had left Malfoy Manor composed, and she would arrive at Dumbledore's door composed, and she would remain composed throughout whatever came next, because there was no other option that served any purpose she could identify. The portrait galleries thinned as she climbed. She had passed 2 groups of students and moved through them without catching anyone's eye. Her pace neither hurried nor slow, her face arranged in the particular expression that communicated, "Do not address me with sufficient clarity that no one had." The students parted and closed behind her like water. Whatever else could be said about her education, it had included a thorough instruction in how to occupy a room without being drawn into it. She reached the 7th floor and turned down the corridor that led toward the stone gargoyle she remembered from her one official visit here, many years ago, as a prefect accompanying a younger student for some administrative matter she could no longer recall. The gargoyle had not changed. It stood squat and ugly and alert looking at the base of the staircase, and it looked at her with the expression of a thing that was waiting for her to attempt something inadvisable. She stopped in front of it. She did not know the password. She had known, when she left the manor, that she would not know it. Dumbledore changed his passwords regularly. She had heard this in passing from Draco's letters years ago, when Draco's letters had still contained more than the flat minimum, and they were always some variety of confectionery, which struck her as the sort of whim only a man who was entirely untouchable would indulge. She had not expected to know it. She had expected to wait. The portraits were the other option, and she dismissed it. The portraits in this corridor were headmaster portraits, and headmaster portraits were explicitly part of the castle's communication infrastructure. They could leave their frames, travel to other paintings, carry information back and forth through the school's walls. Asking a portrait for the password meant asking something that remembered everything and talked to everything. She would leave no trace here if she could help it, and she could help it. She would wait. She folded her hands in front of her, settled her weight evenly, and became very still. She had been still for approximately 4 minutes when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She recognized the sound before she recognized the person. Flat, purposeful, the tread of someone who had somewhere to be and was going there without performance. When Molly Weasley came around the corner, the recognition was mutual and it was immediate. There was no moment of uncertainty, no beat of possible misidentification. They had never spoken to each other. They had been in the same room on perhaps 3 occasions over the previous decade, at ministry functions or Hogwarts events, where the two families had existed in the same space with the enforced civility of people who understood that a scene would cost everyone something. They knew each other the way people knew each other in wartime, by reputation, by association, by the particular way your name sat in someone else's mouth when they said it with contempt. Molly Weasley stopped. Narcissa did not move. For a moment the corridor held them both, the stone walls cold on either side, and a portrait of a sleeping witch somewhere to the left, making small, regular sounds of dreaming. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing yet that required speech, and they both seemed to understand this at the same moment, that whatever was about to happen, it would not be helped by making it into a conversation. Narcissa did not look away. This was another thing her education had been thorough about. She thought about what she knew of the Weasleys as a family. She knew the outline of it, the shape that the name made in Lucius's vocabulary. Blood traitors, order members, the kind of people who had the wrong kind of pride about the wrong things, who drove a flying Ford Anglia and lived in a house that was structurally questionable, and bred children with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of people who did not worry about what those children would inherit. She had heard the name said in the drawing room 100 times over 20 years, and it had never meant anything beyond a category, an example of something. She had not thought about it particularly carefully until this moment, standing in a corridor at Hogwarts across from the woman herself, who was shorter than Narcissa had expected, and whose red hair was pulled back practically, and whose face was the kind of face that was probably, in most circumstances, warm. This was not most circumstances, and the face was not warm. She knew, as one knew things in wartime, through peripheral information, overheard conversations, the accumulated second-hand knowledge that accumulated whether or not you sought it, that this woman's brothers had died in the First War. Fabian Pruett, Gideon Pruett, Order members, both of them, killed by 5 Death Eaters in the last years of the conflict. She had never been told this directly. She had never sought the information out. It was simply there, somewhere in the layers of things she knew, because this was how wartime functioned. You absorbed information about casualties the way you absorbed cold, without meaning to, without being able to stop it. She did not allow herself to examine how she knew it. She watched Molly Weasley look at her. She watched the precise sequence of it, the eyes moving across the expensive robes, the white blonde hair, the composed face, the way Narcissa stood with her hands folded in front of her, in the manner of someone who had been taught how to stand and had learned it well enough that it looked like nature. She watched Molly read these things, and she watched the expression that followed. Not hostility, exactly, or not only hostility, but something that tightened around the eyes and hardened the line of the mouth in a way that was specific and was not about Narcissa at all. It was about Bellatrix. This happened. Narcissa had known it her whole life, the way you knew things that were simply true and had always been true. That people looked at her and looked for her sister and found the trace of her. The bone structure that the Black family shared, the pale coloring, the height. She and Bellatrix did not look alike in any way that Narcissa could ever see clearly when she stood in front of a mirror. Too many years between them. Too much that was different, but from a distance, evidently, the resemblance was legible. She had watched it register in people's faces more times than she could count. The slight flinch, the reassessment, the hardening. She could not fault it, precisely. She had chosen not to examine the political uses to which her sister's name had been put over the last 2 decades, and that choosing was itself a position. And she understood this. She understood it the way she understood her own reflection, clearly and without looking at it for too long. The footsteps that broke the silence were neither of theirs. A member of staff turned the corner from the direction of the staircases, moving with the brisk indifference of someone who had a great many other things to do, and was doing this one only in passing. They addressed the gargoyle without slowing, speaking a word that Narcissa caught the sound of, but would not remember afterwards. Something sweet, something inconsequential, and the gargoyle scraped aside, and the staircase behind it began to revolve. Narcissa moved first, because she had been closer. She did not look back to see if Molly Weasley followed. She heard the footsteps on the stone behind her, and knew, and that was sufficient. They rose on the turning staircase, in silence, separated by 4 steps, and the particular atmosphere of 2 people who had just agreed, without any words, to enter the same room and deal with the consequences once they were in it. The staff member had already gone. The corridor behind them was empty. Neither woman thanked anyone for anything. The door at the top of the stairs was not closed. It stood a few inches open, the way a door stands when someone has left in a hurry and not troubled themselves to pull it fully shut. Not an invitation, not a lock, simply an absence of barrier. Narcissa paused on the landing for one moment, listening, and heard nothing from within. She pushed the door open and went in. The office was circular, and the ceiling was high, and the light came from somewhere that was not immediately apparent. A diffuse, amber warmth that had no single source, the kind of light that existed in very old rooms as a form of architectural memory. Around the walls, the portraits of previous headmasters and headmistresses hung in their heavy frames, and all of them were asleep. Their chests rose and fell in small, steady rhythms. Several had mouths slightly open. One very old woman in a rough collar was snoring almost imperceptibly. They had the look of people who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had decided, sensibly, to sleep through the wait. Molly Weasley came through the door behind her. Narcissa heard the soft sound of her footfall and did not turn. She moved instead toward the far side of the room, away from the desk, toward the window where the autumn light pressed grey and even against the glass. She heard Molly stop inside the threshold and understood, without needing to confirm it, that Molly was doing the same thing she was, reading the room, taking inventory, choosing where to place herself. For Molly, stepping into Dumbledore's office felt nothing like she had imagined it would. She had been here twice before, briefly, on order business in the years since the war had resumed, and she had not lingered either time. Now, with no particular rush in her and the room quiet around her, she found herself taking it in properly. The sleeping portraits, the silver instruments on their shelves along the walls, spinning and ticking and measuring things she had no names for, catching the amber light on their surfaces and throwing it back in small, bright arcs. A bird on a high perch, enormous, absolutely motionless, its plumage the red of firelight and the gold of embers cooling. A phoenix. She had not known he kept a phoenix, though it made a certain kind of sense. Dumbledore was a man whose surroundings tended toward the significant. Against the far wall, a black cabinet stood closed. Through the crack between its doors she could just make out the rim of something stone inside, wide and shallow, giving off a faint blue-white light. She and Narcissa Malfoy stood in the same room and did not speak. This was, Molly thought, probably the correct decision. She was not certain what she would say if she opened her mouth. She was not certain it would be anything she wanted to have said in a room that contained sleeping portraits, capable of waking and traveling and reporting to people she did not know. She found an unremarkable section of wall near the bookcase and stood in front of it with her hands at her sides and waited for Dumbledore to return. The instruments ticked. One of them exhaled a small curl of purple smoke at irregular intervals, which drifted toward the ceiling and dissolved. The snoring portrait continued to snore. Narcissa was at the window. She had not intended to look at the desk. Looking at the headmaster's desk, with its papers and notes and whatever private correspondence lay there, was precisely the kind of action that could not be undone afterward. The kind of action that, if reported, transformed her visit from a desperate mother's errand into something that looked rather like intelligence gathering. She was not gathering intelligence. She had come to speak to a man, and the man was not here, and the sensible thing was to wait. What sat on the desk was not sealed. It was not locked in a drawer or pinned beneath a paperweight or in any way indicated as private. It was a sheaf of parchment, loosely gathered, lying face up at the center of the desk in the manner of documents actively in use, the way papers sat when someone had stepped away for 5 minutes and expected to be back. She picked it up. It was a reflex rather than a decision. The hand moving before the rest of her had finished arguing. She held the pages and began to read, and everything else she had been thinking about went quiet. The handwriting was precise and small. Notes, not a formal record. The margins were written in, too, little arrows and bracketed observations that suggested a mind working outward in more than one direction at once. The document concerned 2 subjects, woven together in a way that felt deliberate: a family at Hogwarts and a family that had lost someone to the war. She found Draco's name on the 2nd page. What Dumbledore had written about him was not what she had expected. There was no accusation in it, No sentence of the kind she had braced for. The language of an official report, something that could be handed to the ministry and used. Instead, there were observations. The boy's physical appearance over the course of the year, noted with the attentiveness of someone who had been watching closely and with some concern. The word deteriorating appeared, and beside it a notation that read 16 and impossible, and under that a line she had to read twice to understand. No mark. Not taken. She did not know how he had confirmed this. She did not know it mattered to her in the way it turned out to matter to her, standing at Dumbledore's desk with the parchment in her hands and the office quiet around her. She became very still. "What is that?" The voice came from the other side of the room. Low, not gentle, nothing so deliberate as gentle. Simply quiet, in the way of someone who had decided to ask a question rather than not ask it. Molly Weasley was looking at her, not at the parchment, at her face. Narcissa set the document down on the desk. She did it slowly, without hurry, taking care not to disturb the arrangement of the other pages. Then she took one step back, and another, until she was at the window again. She did not answer. There was no answer she could give that would cost her less than giving no answer at all. Molly crossed the room. She moved without hesitating around the side of the desk and picked up the sheaf of parchment the way she picked up things her children had left lying where they shouldn't have. Directly, without the ceremony of permission. She read standing up, the pages held in front of her, and the room around her went away. There was Draco Malfoy, 16 years old, assigned an impossible task, watched and noted and worried over in language that was neither sympathetic nor indifferent, but something more difficult than either. Careful. There was a line Dumbledore had written about the boy that she had to stop at, because it was phrased in a way she recognized, the way you phrased things when you could not say the plainest version. The boy will not complete it. He was not meant to. This is not a mission. It is a sentence. She turned the page. Fabian, Gideon. Their names were there in Dumbledore's handwriting, in a section of notes that predated the Draco entries by a decade or more, the ink a slightly different color, older pages filed together with new ones, the way someone organized their thinking rather than their correspondence. Both names were written fully, not abbreviated. Beside each was a date she did not need to look at, because she had known those dates for 15 years, and below them, in a line that had clearly been written later than the rest, added after, perhaps much later, 2 words she would think about for a long time. Remembered. Present. She did not move for a long moment. When she finally looked up, Narcissa Malfoy was at the window with her back to the desk, looking out at the grey October grounds. She was not watching Molly. She was simply there, with her hands folded in front of her and her shoulders very straight and her face turned away, in the posture of someone who has put something down and is not yet ready to speak about having done it. The parchment sat in Molly's hands. The portraits breathed. The phoenix had not moved. Neither woman said anything. They were not ready for anything that would require words. But the quality of the silence was no longer what it had been in the corridor, no longer the managed quiet of mutual hostility and mutual restraint. Something had shifted in it without any declaration being made. Something had simply quietly changed. She went back to the beginning. She had read it once already. The initial sweep, the first absorption, and she had understood the shape of it, but understanding the shape of something and understanding the thing were not the same, and she found she needed to start again. She stood at the desk with the parchment in both hands and read Dumbledore's notes about Draco Malfoy from the first line. What struck her was the precision of it. Dumbledore had not written about Draco Malfoy the way you wrote about an adversary, or even the way you wrote about a problem that needed solving. He had written about him the way a doctor wrote about a patient, observationally, with care, with the particular attention of someone who was watching for signs of change and recording what he found. The word deteriorating appeared early, and then again, and beside it, details she recognized as coming from close and sustained observation, the hollowing of the face over successive weeks, the eyes that had stopped carrying whatever they used to carry, the shoulders that had begun to curve inward with the weight of something being carried invisibly. A boy of 16 doing the work of a man who had chosen. Except, Dumbledore had noted, and this was the thing she read 3 times, the choosing had not meaningfully happened. The task had been laid on him. The mission was designed to fail. He had been handed an impossible thing by a man who intended it to break him, and he was dutifully attempting to lift it alone. She did not allow herself to feel sympathy. That was not what was called for at this particular moment. What was called for was precision, which was one of the few things Molly Weasley had in such natural abundance that she could use it even now, in the office of the headmaster of Hogwarts, with a document she had no right to be reading. So she was precise about it. She held it up against what she knew and tested it. Draco Malfoy was 16 years old. Ron was 16 years old. Ron, who had come home from the Department of Mysteries in June with scars on his arms from a thinking brain's grip, and had refused to show her how bad they were for 3 weeks, who played Quidditch with the particular commitment of someone who has found the one thing that reliably makes him feel useful, and who wrote her letters that were 90% complaint and 10% the small news of a boy who was mostly all right, who was getting on with it, who was, in his own imperfect way, fine. Ron, who was 16. Ginny was 15. She turned this over several times. She had categorized Draco Malfoy as an enemy for years. Not an abstraction, not a metaphor, an actual specific enemy. The boy who had called her daughter a mudblood in a public corridor when he was 11 years old, who had tormented her sons in every year she had known about, and some she probably hadn't. He was the Malfoy boy. He had always been the Malfoy boy, in the same way that the manor was the Malfoy manor, and the contempt was the Malfoy contempt. All of it part of a single coherent thing that you recognized and kept your distance from. He was also, per these notes, visibly grey and hollow-eyed, and being used by someone with no interest in whether he survived it. These 2 things were both true. She held them side by side, and did not rush toward a conclusion. She read on. A passage about the mother, a brief notation, almost clinical, written as though it was simply a relevant fact, rather than the thing that Molly suspected it actually was, which was one of Dumbledore's more careful observations. Narcissa Malfoy had not taken the dark mark. Not taken it, or not been offered it, or refused it. The notes didn't specify, and perhaps he didn't know. But the mark's absence was recorded there in his small, precise script, as though it mattered. As though the distinction between a woman who had chosen the mark and a woman who had not was to him a distinction worth keeping. She had not known that. She turned the page. The Prewett section was deeper in the document, in pages that were clearly older than the rest, the parchment slightly different in colour, the ink a shade less dark, the handwriting the same, but with the small differences that 30 years of use made to a man's hand. It was organized around the same period as the rest, the First Wizarding War, the losses, the names. And there, in the same careful script that had described Draco Malfoy's eyes going dull over the course of a Hogwarts term, were her brothers' names. Fabian, Gideon, not their surnames, their given names, which was the way you wrote about people you had known rather than people you had only recorded. Both dates. Under Fabian's name, a bracketed note. Found each other, she thought it said, or possibly held. The handwriting was slightly harder to read on that line, as though it had been written in a moment of less steadiness than usual. Under Gideon's nothing extra. Just the name and the date, and below it, in an entry that had been added later, she could tell by the ink again, a single line that said, Order. These are the ones who do not get commemorated publicly. They must be kept somewhere. She read it twice. She had spent 15 years knowing that her brothers were dead. She had spent 15 years carrying it in the way that you carried enormous losses. Not always at the front of you, not crushing you at every moment. But there, permanently and inerasably there, the way a scar was not always painful, but was always present if you pressed it. She had not spent much time thinking about whether anyone outside the family had kept the weight of it. She had not thought about whether Albus Dumbledore had written her brothers' names on a page in his private notes and added them to a record of people the war had taken, because it had not occurred to her that this was the kind of record he kept. He had kept count. He had written them down. Not for the ministry, not for a memorial. Not because it was required. Because he found it necessary. Because he was a man who had been carrying this war longer than anyone alive, and he had apparently decided that keeping the names was part of the weight he owed. Something small and solid shifted in her chest. Not broke, that was not quite the right word. Moved. Gave way slightly, the way old wood gave way when the weather changed. She became aware that she had been looking at the page for a long time. She looked up. Narcissa Malfoy was still at the window. Her posture had not changed. The straight back, the composed set of the shoulders, the general impression of a woman who would stand exactly like this, even if the building caught fire around her. But her hands, clasped in front of her, were clasped too hard. The knuckles had gone white. Molly watched her for a moment. "How old is he?" she asked. Her voice came out lower than she expected. Narcissa did not turn from the window. A pause. Not long. 16. She did not ask who Molly meant. Molly did not ask who she meant. There was no ambiguity about who was 16. There was only one person in either of their heads at this particular moment. The silence that settled after was not the silence of the corridor, managed and hostile and made of two women deciding not to speak. It was something else, something that had less edge to it, something that had a quality of mutual recognition in it, without requiring either of them to name the recognition or do anything with it. Two women who had been carrying the same category of fear for the whole of a very long war, and had just, without meaning to, looked at each other across it. Molly set the document back on Dumbledore's desk. She arranged the pages as she had found them. She stepped back. Neither of them spoke. The room was not the same room it had been when they entered it. She could not have explained what had changed about it. Nothing visible had changed. The portrait still slept. The phoenix sat still on its perch. The silver instruments caught the light. But something in the atmosphere of it had shifted in the way that air shifted before a change in weather. Not the change itself yet, only the first unmistakable sign that one was coming. The silence between them lasted perhaps 2 minutes after Molly set the document down. Not comfortable. Nothing between them was comfortable yet, and Narcissa was not naive enough to expect it to be. But different from what had preceded it. They were two women occupying the same room without managing each other, which was not the same as warmth, but was considerably more bearable than the alternative. She was still at the window when the door opened. He did not knock. This did not surprise her. Severus Snape had always moved through spaces with the air of a man who had calculated exactly how much deference was warranted by any given room, and concluded that the answer was usually very little. He came through the door in a sweep of black robes, his face in its habitual expression of controlled attention, and then he saw the two of them, and stopped. It lasted less than a second. The stillness was brief and total, the kind of stillness that only happened when a person encountered something significantly outside what they had anticipated. And then his face closed, and the stillness became the ordinary stillness of Severus Snape standing in a room, which was the particular stillness of a man for whom all expressions were a form of strategy. He and Narcissa did not look at each other. There was no glance, no signal. She kept her eyes on the grey grounds through the window. She heard Molly Weasley shift slightly behind her, and understood that Molly had registered the absence of exchange, had registered it as meaningful, and was now holding this information somewhere. This was the thing about Spinner's End. What had happened there, what she had asked for, what he had given, was not something that resolved. It lived between them as a permanent structure, invisible and irremovable, and people who were paying attention could feel it. She had not considered that Molly Weasley was the kind of person who paid attention to invisible structures. She was revising this assessment now. Snape's first words were not addressed to her. "Mrs. Weasley." His tone was not unpleasant. It was simply final, in the manner of a man who considered finality to be a form of courtesy. "You should wait in the entrance hall. This is the headmaster's office, and his affairs are not public." Molly Weasley did not move. She did not raise her voice either, which Narcissa noted. She had half expected the Weasley woman to bristle. She had the colouring for it, and the general manner of someone who did not take direction from people she did not trust. Instead, she simply stood where she was, in the flat, immovable way of a woman who had made her decision and had nothing further to negotiate about it. "I'll wait here," Molly said. Snape regarded her for a moment with the expression of someone who had noted an obstacle and was deciding whether to go around it or through it. "The matter at hand is not one you have standing in," he said. "When the headmaster—" "There was a student cursed on the Hogsmeade Road this morning," Molly said. Her voice was steady, and her face was the face of a woman who was being very careful to stay this side of the line she would regret crossing. "My children are in this school. I want to know whether whoever arranged that attack is a known source. I want to know whether the school is aware of a specific threat, or whether this was random." Snape looked at her for a moment that went on slightly longer than necessary. "The security of the school," he said, "is the headmaster's concern. When the headmaster returns, he will— You are the deputy headmaster." "When the headmaster returns," Snape repeated, with the inflectionless patience of a man who could do this indefinitely. "I am certain he will address any concerns you have. In the meantime, I would ask you again to wait downstairs." Narcissa watched this exchange from the window. She knew exactly what Snape was doing. She had spent enough time in rooms with him, at the Dark Lord's meetings, at Spinner's End, in the corridor conversations that were not conversations so much as exchanges of information conducted in code, to recognize the mechanism. He was denying everything by refusing to confirm anything. He was giving Molly Weasley no information, and he was doing it so smoothly and with such complete calm that he could deny, afterward, that there had been any information to withhold. He was protecting Draco. This was what she had asked him to do. The vow required it. Every term of what had been promised at Spinner's End was being honoured at this moment, in this office, by this particular evasion. She found that she could not fully endorse it. This surprised her. She was not accustomed to finding herself in disagreement with the requirements of her own strategy. But there was something about standing at this window, in this room, watching Snape manage a woman who had simply wanted to know whether her children were safe. There was something about it that made her aware of a very similar management, one she had been on the receiving end of for months, letters sent and received through intermediaries, carefully worded reports that told her Draco was at Hogwarts, and no more than that. The information she had asked for, and been given, delivered in the form of everything except the thing she actually needed to know. She was being protected. She understood this. She had asked for protection, had structured the whole of Spinner's End around it, had stood with her hands in Bellatrix and asked a man she neither fully trusted nor fully distrusted to keep her son alive. The protection was real. The vow was real. And still she stood at a window and knew things about her own son that she had inferred rather than been told. And the knowing had the particular quality of knowledge gathered from outside a door rather than inside the room. She had not intended to speak. The words came out quietly, not addressed to Molly, to him. "I am not one of his portraits, Severus." He turned. This was the first time he had directly looked at her since entering the room. "I did not travel from Wiltshire," she continued in the same even voice, "in order to sit in a frame and sleep and wait for someone to require my services. I came because I needed to be somewhere and to do something, and I have done neither, and I would prefer not to be sent to the corridor." The silence that followed this was of a specific texture. She was aware of Molly Weasley somewhere to her right, very still. Snape looked at her for a moment that she held without expression, without apology, without the slight deference she had always given him, because it cost her nothing and made things easier. She didn't give it now. Something moved across his face that was not quite what she had expected to put there. Not anger, not calculation. Something smaller and more private than either. The expression of a man who had been reproached by someone he had not thought capable of reproaching him, and found, in the moment of it, that he had not prepared an answer. He left. He said nothing further. He closed the door behind him with the quiet precision of someone who was very carefully not slamming it. The room settled. Narcissa became aware that she had moved away from the window without meaning to. She was standing closer to the center of the room than she had intended, and her hands, which she had folded in front of her, were not folded quite as neatly as usual. She reorganized them. She looked at the window. She did not look at Molly Weasley. Molly Weasley was looking at her. She knew this the way she knew most things in a room she was paying attention to, peripherally, without needing to confirm it directly. She knew also that Molly had seen the moment, the small as specific moment, when something that was not the managed composure had come out of her mouth instead. She could not unsay it. She would not have taken it back. She did not speak. Molly did not speak, but the quality of Molly's attention had changed, or perhaps she was only now properly registering what had been in it from the first, the particular way of looking at a person that was not hostility and was not warmth, but was something that had made room for more than one thing at once. Honest. It was honest. Narcissa turned back to the window and let it stand. She had constructed Albus Dumbledore from the outside in, the way one constructed figures one could only know at a distance, from reports, from reputation, from the shape of his name in conversations where it served as a synonym for the opposition. The architecture she had arrived at was large and cold and absolute, a man who had arranged the world to suit a particular moral vision and did not concern himself greatly with what the arrangement cost. She had not imagined him old. He came through the door with the unhurried certainty of someone returning to his own room at the end of a long day, and when he saw them both standing there, Narcissa at the center of the room, Molly Weasley near the bookcase, the document lying on his desk exactly as neither of them had touched it, his expression did not change in any way that suggested surprise. His eyebrows, silver and abundant, rose slightly. That was all. "Ah," he said, and closed the door. He was very tall, in robes the deep blue of late evening, his silver hair past his shoulders, his half-moon spectacles catching the amber light of the room. He moved around both of them, without requiring either to step aside, with the ease of someone for whom other people's presence in a space was simply one of the room's features, and he settled into the chair behind his desk with the deliberateness of a man who had been on his feet for some time. Then he put his hands on the desk. The right hand lay flat on the surface, and she could see it clearly for the first time. Blackened from the wrist to the fingertips, the skin darkened and shrunken around the knuckles, the whole of it carrying the unmistakable quality of something that had been killed and not yet fallen away. She had seen curse marks before. She had been raised in a house where such things were sometimes present and sometimes discussed, and always treated as evidence of something that had happened and could not be undone. This was not the work of a day or a week. This was months of a curse moving through a body that had decided, on the whole, to live. He did not conceal it. He did not arrange it beneath the desk or fold it away from view. He simply set it on the surface of his desk as though it were an ordinary hand, and looked at them both with the particular quality of attention that Narcissa recognized after a moment as the attention of a man who already knew what questions were coming and had decided, in advance, which he would answer. "Mrs. Malfoy," he said. His voice was conversational and not unkind. "You are here about your son." It was not a question. She had expected a question. "Yes," she said, because there was nothing else to say. He regarded her for a moment, with those pale blue eyes that were considerably sharper than their surroundings suggested. "Draco is safer within these walls than he would be anywhere else at the present time. I want you to understand that this is not a reassurance. It is a statement of fact. The alternatives to Hogwarts are, for him, considerably more dangerous than any threat the school currently presents." He paused, and she understood, without being told, exactly what he was not saying. While he remains here, certain outcomes remain postponed. That is not a small thing. She held this. She turned it over. She looked for the lie in it, and did not find one, which was more unsettling than if she had. "He will not be expelled," she said. "He will not." Dumbledore tilted his head slightly. "I am quite certain that this is the better choice, for everyone involved, including your son." He did not ask her why she had come. He did not express disapproval. He did not tell her she should not be here. He simply gave her the information she had come for, in the plainest form he could manage, and moved on, which was a thing she had not expected him to do. She had expected negotiation. She had expected the performance of authority. She had expected to be made to feel the irregularity of her presence in his office. He was already looking past her, toward Molly Weasley. Mrs. Weasley. His tone did not change. If anything, it became slightly warmer. Not sentimental, but with the warmth of long acquaintance. "You are here about the road." "Yes," Molly said from behind her. "The attack was real. The source is known to me." His voice was measured and unhurried. "It is being addressed. It will not recur in that form." He looked at her steadily. Ronald and Ginevra are in my care. I want to be precise with you. I cannot promise you perfectly safe, because nowhere is perfectly safe, and you know this better than most. But I can tell you that they are in my care, and that I am paying attention to this, and that what happened on the Hogsmeade Road is not indicative of a threat I am failing to manage. There was a beat of silence. Narcissa was watching Molly's face from the angle she could see it, and she saw the particular way Molly absorbed a statement that was not comfort. The slight tightening around the eyes, then the release of it, the recognition of something real. Dumbledore indicated the 2 chairs before his desk with the ease of someone who had been conducting difficult conversations in this room for 30 years and knew exactly how people needed to be arranged in order to have them properly. They sat. This was, Narcissa thought, the thing that no one warned you about when they talked about Albus Dumbledore. That the man's particular form of power was not authority, but honesty. He was not telling them what they wanted to hear. He was telling them what was true. She sat in the chair and felt the particular strange sensation of having been given something real. She became aware again of his hand. It was in her eye line from where she sat, flat on the desk, dark and wrong, the color of something burned rather than cursed, except that she knew the difference, and this was a curse. Old magic, old and deliberate, designed to move through the body over time rather than strike all at once. She spoke before she had fully decided to speak. "That hand," she said. "How long?" She had not meant it as a question. It was not compassion. She had not come here to feel compassion for Albus Dumbledore, and she would not pretend otherwise. It was the reflex of a woman who had grown up in the Black family, where knowing the shape and age of curse damage was not morbidity, but survival. Where looking at something and naming what it was had been, since childhood, the first line of defense. He looked at her for a moment, and his expression had in it something that was not quite surprise, and not quite recognition, and was something between them. "It is of no concern to either of you," he said, gently, finally. The subject was closed. He had said it in the tone of someone who had closed a door and locked it from the inside, and she did not push further. She had been told. She accepted it, which was perhaps the only available response. She became aware that Molly Weasley was looking at her. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on Dumbledore's desk, but she was acutely aware of the specific quality of Molly's attention, the particular stillness of a person who has just seen something she was not expecting. Narcissa knew the question had been involuntary. She had not decided to ask it. It had come from somewhere below the managed surface, from the part of her that had been watching that hand since he sat down, and had recognized what it was before any reasoning had caught up with the recognition. She had assumed the picture was fixed. Malfoy, Black, enemy, Bellatrix's sister. The usual ledger. She was less certain now that Molly was still looking at it. Dumbledore opened the document on his desk. He spread the pages with one hand, the good one, and began to read, and the quality of his attention shifted in the way that a fire shifted when someone opened a window. Not gone, but redirected. He was reading. He was, in the most polite possible way, no longer conducting this meeting. Neither woman stood immediately. Then Molly rose, and Narcissa rose, and they left. The staircase wound them down, and the gargoyle closed behind them, and they were in the corridor again, stone and cold, and the distant sound of the castle going about its afternoon. They walked in the same direction, which was the only direction available, and for 3 steps they walked together, and did not speak, and then Narcissa turned toward the stairs that would take her back down toward the gates. She did not look through Molly as she turned. She looked at her, a look that was brief and direct, and contained nothing so simple as acknowledgement, and nothing so complicated as warmth, but sat somewhere between the two, in a place that had not existed this morning. Molly looked back. Then they each went the way they were going. The manor settled into its afternoon quiet as she came through the door. Apparition left a fraction of a second of disorientation, the slight lurch of a body that had been one place and was now another, and she stood in the entrance hall and breathed through it. The house was very large and very still, no fire in the hearth to the left. She had stopped asking the house elves to light fires in rooms she did not plan to use, and she did not plan to use many rooms now. She set her gloves on the hall table and went through to the drawing room. The grey afternoon light came in through the tall windows in long, flat lines. She sat in the smaller chair by the window, not Lucius's chair, which she had learned by the end of the first month not to occupy without reason, and looked out at the grounds. Draco is safer within these walls than he would be anywhere else at the present time. She held this. Dumbledore had not said it the way people said things to comfort. He had said it the way people said things that were true and had decided they owed you the truth rather than the softened version. She had believed him, which was not something she had expected to happen, and she was going to have to now decide what to do with the believing. He had not expelled Draco. He would not. And the alternative to Hogwarts, the thing she had not allowed herself to examine directly in the month since June, was the manor in winter, and Draco under a set of eyes that would not look at him the way Dumbledore had looked at those notes, carefully, with full understanding of what he had been made to carry. She had not intended to ask about the hand. She did not ask questions she had not prepared to ask. She had been trained, from childhood, in the discipline of saying nothing until you knew what you were going to say. But the Black family reflex had moved through her before reasoning could catch it, the reflex that named things, that refused the comfortable habit of looking away from curse damage. She had asked before she had finished deciding to ask, and Molly Weasley had been in the room, and Molly Weasley had seen it. She was still turning this over when she heard the sound at the door. Bellatrix did not knock. This had never been unusual. The manor had been the family's house, all three of them, and she had retained the assumption of access through the decades since. Narcissa heard the door, and had a half-second to arrange everything into the expression she was going to need before Bellatrix came through the drawing-room doorway. She was standing there with her long black hair loose around her shoulders, her heavy-lidded dark eyes fixed on Narcissa, with the quality of attention Narcissa had known since childhood, and still found required management. 9 months out of Azkaban, and the gauntness remained, her face sharper than it had been, pulled toward the bone, with the wild intensity in it that had been there long before Azkaban, and was now simply more visible. She stood very straight and looked at Narcissa the way she looked at anyone she suspected of something, directly, without blinking, with the patience of a woman who had learned how to wait. "Hogwarts," Bellatrix said. Not a question. "Hogwarts," Narcissa agreed. "The Dark Lord's work requires—" "I know what it requires." She kept her voice level. "Draco is at Hogwarts. I went to Hogwarts. I spoke to the headmaster briefly. I came home." She looked at her sister steadily. "I told him nothing he did not already know." Bellatrix moved into the room, the quality of coiled energy underneath the surface that made her walking look like something she was doing while waiting to do something else. She stopped near the center of the room and did not sit. "You had no business there that serves us." "I had business that serves Draco," Narcissa said, "which serves us, as he is the one engaged in this. I did not go to interfere. I went to understand the situation, which I am permitted to do. What did you understand? That the school is functioning as it should, that Draco is present and in possession of his task. She folded her hands in her lap. That Dumbledore is occupied with larger concerns than the activities of one student. This was the lie. She had prepared a careful and internally consistent version of events on the walk from the Hogwarts gates to the apparition point. What had happened, and what had not, and where the line between them fell. But Bellatrix was not asking about notes on a desk or a woman in a corridor. She was asking whether Narcissa had compromised something. The answer to that was no. She had gone to a room where information existed and had received it without giving anything in exchange, because there was nothing to give that the room did not already contain. Technically defensible. She had been trained as a Black and then as a Malfoy to know precisely where those lines were. Bellatrix regarded her for a long moment. "The Weasley children are at that school," she said. Not as an accusation, in the tone of someone raising an irrelevance, something at the edge of a concern rather than the concern itself. Order brats, every one of them. Their mother was sniffing around the castle the same morning, I'm told, as though she has anything useful to contribute. Narcissa said nothing. What came to her, immediately and without permission, from somewhere below the managed surface, was the image of Molly Weasley's face. Not the face in the corridor, hardened in recognition. Not the face during the exchange with Snape. The face when she had been reading. The particular expression on it when she reached the page with her brothers' names, standing at Dumbledore's desk with the parchment in both hands and the light coming grey through the windows. The way it had changed, not breaking, not collapsing into something visible, but shifting in the small, specific way of an expression absorbing something it had not expected to receive, remembered, present. Narcissa kept her hands folded. "Yes," she said. I imagined she was. Bellatrix made the sound she made when a subject had been considered and found insufficiently interesting to continue with. She looked at Narcissa for another moment, the searching look, the inventory, and then something in the set of her face decided, and she moved toward the door. "You'll be careful," Bellatrix said. It was not a request. "I am always careful," Narcissa said. She heard the door, then the particular silence that came after. The drawing room settled around her. The grey light through the windows had not changed. The grounds beyond the glass were Wiltshire grey, the trees at the far edge of the property holding their October leaves grudgingly in small patches of amber and dark gold against a flat sky. She had looked at these grounds every autumn she could remember and found them appropriate, and had not thought much further than that. This silence was not the office silence. In the office there had been containment, stone and amber light pressing in, making the space finite, making the things happening inside it feel bounded. This was the manor in the winter that was coming, very large, with no limits that felt real, expanding in every direction, and producing the sensation of sitting at the center of something with no edges. She had come back here and performed correctly. She had answered Bellatrix and looked at her steadily, and said the true parts that were defensible and omitted the rest. She had kept her hands still. She had not looked at the door when the Weasley name came up. She was good at this. She had spent her adult life being good at this. The thought arrived without announcement. What she wanted for Draco, specifically, rather than simply the absence of disaster, rather than postponed outcomes and carefully managed survival, was She set it down. She put it aside with the same care with which she had set Dumbledore's document back on the desk, with both hands and without hurrying. The thought was not finished. She was not ready to look at what was in it, and she knew, with the particular knowledge of a woman who had been carrying things she was not ready to look at for most of her adult life, that she would come back to it. She stood. She went upstairs. She had made bread that afternoon. The kitchen still smelled of it, under the cold that had come in through the window she'd opened without thinking before bed, under the low smell of the fire she'd let go out while she sat at the table, under the accumulation of everything else that a kitchen this size held at the end of a day. Bread, specifically. She had made it because she didn't know what else to do with her hands, and now it was past midnight, and she was in the kitchen again because she could not sleep. She hadn't bothered to light the lamps. The window gave enough light, the moonlight coming pale through the old glass and spreading across the stone floor in a way she had looked at so many times over so many years that the shape of it was as familiar as the shape of her own hands. The kitchen of the Burrow at night was a room she knew as well as she knew any room, which was completely in the way that you knew rooms you had sat in for 30 years. Every creak of the chair, every particular way the cold came in under the back door, the exact sound the house made when it settled. She could see the clock from where she sat. 9 hands, all pointing somewhere she could account for. Arthur upstairs, Ron and Ginny at Hogwarts, Percy at work, which was what the clock said, and was likely the most she was going to know for some time. Percy's hand had been pointing at work for over a year, which was not a location so much as a message, and she had stopped trying to change it. 9 hands, all present. She looked at the clock and tried to let this do what it usually did. Tell her that everyone she loved was somewhere she knew, at least approximately. She sat with it until it almost worked, and then she looked away. The document. She had not allowed herself to think about it directly. She had come home and made bread and answered Arthur's questions in the way you answered questions when you needed to not think yet. And she had moved through the rest of the afternoon the way you moved through an afternoon when something large had happened that you were not ready to look at until the house was quiet around you. The house was quiet now. The document had said that Draco Malfoy was 16 years old and had been assigned a task that was, by Dumbledore's careful assessment, impossible. Not difficult. Not beyond his skills. Impossible. Designed to fail. The boy will not complete it. He was not meant to. Dumbledore had written it with the precision of someone recording a fact rather than rendering a verdict, which was somehow worse than a verdict would have been. She thought about what 16 looked like. Ron was 16. Ron, who had come home from the Department of Mysteries in June with scars on his arms that she had eventually, after 3 weeks, persuaded him to show her, who played chess in the same focused, near-silent way that other people prayed, who had an opinion about Quidditch strategy he would defend at any hour with the commitment of someone for whom very few things were both important and safe to be loud about. Ron, who would walk into something frightening without telling her he was frightened, who had never once, to her knowledge, admitted out loud that he was scared of something before he had already done it. She tried to put Draco Malfoy next to him. She tried to make the comparison fit. It would not. Not because the comparison was wrong, she thought, with a reluctance she wasn't going to examine too closely, that it was not wrong, but because fitting it meant releasing something she had held in a particular shape for 6 years, and she was not certain the shape could be released in pieces without the whole thing coming apart. She sat with this for a while. Then she thought about Fabian and Gideon. She did not do this often. Not because the grief was not there. It was there inerasable and permanent the way old grief was permanent, present whenever she pressed on it. But because there was a particular weight to thinking about them directly, that she had learned to manage carefully, the way you learned to manage anything that could, if you miscalculated, sit on your chest and not move. She thought about who had said their names in her presence since they died. Not in conversation with her family, where they were part of the permanent architecture of memory. She meant outside the family. People who had chosen to name them. The list was short, and she had never sat down to make it before, and making it now had a particular quality of surprise. There had been an Order colleague the year before who had shown Harry the old Order photograph and named everyone in it. Harry had mentioned it to her afterward, that Fabian and Gideon were there, that they'd been pointed out. There had been Dumbledore, in writing, in pages that were clearly old, held together with newer pages in his small, precise hand, their given names, both dates, and under Gideon's a line added later, in ink that was a slightly different shade, that said, Order. These are the ones who do not get commemorated publicly. They must be kept somewhere, remembered, present. She had been standing at a dead man's desk reading private notes she had no business reading, and the line had been there, and she had read it twice, and the thing that had moved in her chest had not gone away since. He had kept count of all of them, of everyone the war had taken who would not receive a public memorial, whose names would be on no ministry plaque, who had simply died and been buried and were held afterward only in the people who carried them. He had written them down because he considered it necessary, because he thought it was part of what he owed. And in the same document, 2 pages later, the name of a boy who was 16. She was still sitting with this when she heard the stairs. She had not lit a lamp, but Arthur did not need one. He knew the kitchen too. He came down in the way he came down when he heard her up at night, which was the way he'd come down for 30 years, not asking from upstairs, not calling, just appearing, because the question of whether she wanted company was one he had learned, a long time ago, to answer for himself. He sat down across from her. The chair made its familiar sound. He looked at her face in the moonlight, and did not ask what was wrong in the way that contained an assumption about what the answer was. He waited, which was one of the things he was good at. "I saw something today," she said. "That made me think." He nodded. He did not ask what. She looked at the clock. "I thought I knew what the other side of this war looked like, the people in it. I've been carrying a picture of it for 15 years, and I thought I knew its shape." She paused. "I may have been wrong about one piece of it." Arthur was quiet for a moment. He had the quality, on the rare occasions when he was not talking about Muggle objects, or ministry politics, or some peculiar piece of household news, of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time before he was asked. "Most people who end up somewhere like that," he said, "don't arrive there all at once. They're carried along by something, family, or fear, or decisions that get made for them before they're old enough to make them themselves." He paused. "That's not the same as an excuse. I'm not saying it's an excuse. I'm just saying it's usually how it happens." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I know." He didn't push further. He sat with her for a little while in the kitchen that smelled of bread and cold and the fire she'd let go out, and then he went back upstairs because Arthur understood the difference between keeping someone company and being required to leave. She sat for another few minutes. She was not going to forgive anyone. She was not going to decide, because of a page in a dead man's private notes, that the war had been something other than what it was, or that the people on the other side of it had been doing things that were anything less than the things they had done. She was not made that way, and she did not think she should be made that way, and she did not intend to become someone who confused understanding for exoneration. But the woman she had stood with in Dumbledore's office was no longer a category. She was a face. A woman in expensive robes who had come to a school she had no business being at to find out if her son was all right, who had stood in a corridor and held Molly's look without flinching, who had asked a question in front of Molly, involuntarily, from somewhere below the composed surface, about a dying hand, who had looked at it and named it before she'd decided to speak. That was a face. That was a specific face that belonged to a specific person who had done a specific thing. Molly stood up. She turned off the kitchen and went upstairs. She did not sleep for some time. 3 weeks after the Hogwarts visit, November had settled over Wiltshire with the particular quality of grey that was not quite fog and not quite cloud, but something in between, the kind of light that made the grounds look like a painting of themselves rather than the actual grounds. Narcissa had not told anyone about the office. She had not mentioned the document, or the corridor, or the woman she had stood with on a revolving staircase while neither of them spoke. She carried it the way she carried most things without a category, below the surface, where it could not be examined without her permission. She was reviewing correspondence in the downstairs study when she heard them arrive. Bellatrix did not always announce a visit. This was not new, but Bellatrix had not been alone, and whoever she had brought with her had the particular quality of someone who spoke too much, filling rooms with the sound of their own certainty in the way of people who had never been seriously opposed. Narcissa had heard this voice type before. She stayed where she was. The door to the drawing room was not fully closed. She was not trying to listen, or not exactly. The truth had a small qualification attached to it, which was that she hadn't tried to not listen either. The sound came through the gap in the not-quite-closed door, the way sound moved through old houses, selectively, preferring certain frequencies, carrying certain words more clearly than others. A name, a street, a date. She knew the name. It was not a Weasley name. It was an order name, a name she had stored the same way she stored most peripheral intelligence, without intending to, through the accumulation of overhearing things in rooms she was technically absent from. The connection was enough. She understood what was being planned without understanding the full shape of it. A route that someone travelled regularly, a time when they would be on it, an arrangement that had been made to coincide. She looked at her correspondence. She did not move for some time. She sat in the downstairs study with the letter she had been reviewing in her hands, and she performed, for herself, the calculation she always performed. What this cost, what it risked, what the alternatives were, whether the thing she was considering was something she could explain afterward in terms she would be comfortable with. She had been doing this calculation most of her adult life. She was very good at it. It usually produced a clear result. This time it produced nothing clear at all. What it produced was a face, briefly, against her will. The face of Molly Weasley reading a page in a dead man's office, and the particular way that face had looked when it read about Fabian and Gideon. And under that, without logic, the fact that she had a son who was 16 years old and was at Hogwarts because Hogwarts was the safest place for him, because someone she had never wanted to be indebted to had decided this and told her the truth about it. She waited until she heard Bellatrix leave. Then she went to the writing room. She wrote nothing identifying. No greeting, no crest, no form of address. She wrote what she knew, the name, the route, the timing. In a hand she consciously made smaller and more upright than her usual hand, because someone who could read handwriting would recognize the slant of what she had learned at Hogwarts, and she was not going to make this easier to trace than it had to be. She wrote enough to allow someone who received it to act. Nothing more. She sealed it with plain wax, no impression. She tied it to the leg of the most ordinary owl she kept, a grey bird of no particular distinction that she used for household correspondence, and that would not be recognizable as a Malfoy owl to anyone who didn't know the wards. She gave it the address she had stored from Order connections, and did not let herself think about what she was doing while she was doing it, because that was the most reliable way she knew to continue doing it. The owl went out the window into the grey November morning. She stood at the window for a while after it had gone, in the way she had stood at the Hogwarts window a month ago, and then she went back downstairs and put the interrupted correspondence in order. The owl arrived at the burrow in the late afternoon, when the November dark was already starting to come down, over Devon, and Molly was at the kitchen table with a pot of tea that had gone cold while she read. She did not recognize the bird. It was grey and undistinguished, and looked at her with the expression that post owls sometimes had, the expression of something that had performed its function and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. She untied the note. There was no greeting, no signature. The handwriting was small and upright. Not a hand, she knew. The message was 7 lines long and contained a name, a location, a date, and a brief statement. This route. This time. Change the arrangements. She read it twice. Then she looked at the owl, which told her nothing useful. She read it again. She stood up. She went to find Arthur. The conversation that followed was quiet and short, the kind of conversation that had become routine in Order households. Here is information I have received. Here is what it suggests. Here is what needs to change. Go. Arthur made 2 flu calls she didn't hear from the kitchen. By the following morning, the arrangement that had apparently been made was irrelevant, because the person it would have affected had changed their route without knowing why, because a message had been passed through the appropriate channels that said, "Not that way. Not then." Molly did not tell anyone about the note. She had every reason to tell someone about the note. It was potentially significant intelligence, it was anonymous and therefore suspect. It was the kind of thing that should go to Dumbledore or to the relevant Order members, so they could evaluate both the information and its source. She knew all of this. She was not a person who typically withheld things from the Order. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her dressing gown, which was not where she kept important things, and which meant she was not treating it as an important thing, and which was something she did not examine. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the owl which had stayed. She looked at it for a while. She got a piece of parchment and a quill, and she wrote 2 words. She folded it and tied it to the grey owl's leg, and she said, without raising her voice, "Go back," and the owl went out into the night. She did not sign it. She did not know, with certainty, who she was sending it to. She suspected what she suspected. The owl came back to the manor after dark. Narcissa was in the sitting room. She had been in the sitting room since mid-afternoon, not reading, not writing, simply present in the room that was warmest and most enclosed because the grey November outside had deepened into the particular blackness of a country night, and she had not lit many candles. The fire was burning. She took the note from the owl's leg. 2 words, in a handwriting she did not know, round and practical, the hand of someone who had never thought much about the aesthetic of the letters, but had written so much and so often, over so many years, that the practical hand had a quality of its own, a steadiness to it that was not the same as elegance, but was something more reliable. Thank you. Nothing else. No signature. No return address that would have told her anything she didn't already know about the direction the owl had come from. She sat with it. The fire burned. The sitting room was very still around her. She had grown accustomed to the particular texture of being alone in this house, had found the architecture for it, had learned not to hear the absence of Lucius in every room she occupied. This was a different kind of still. This was the stillness of sitting with a piece of paper in her hands that said 2 words and had been sent from somewhere she had not been planning to reach, by someone she had not planned to affect. She did not know precisely why she had sent the note. She had performed the calculation, and the calculation had told her nothing. And then she had sat in a study and thought about Molly Weasley's face against her will. And then she had written the note, and the logic of the sequence was not a logic she could reconstruct clearly or offer to anyone who asked. She had been raised to have reasons for everything, and the reasons were usually there when she turned them over. She turned this one over. It gave her nothing but the fact that she had done it, and that she hadn't been able to not do it, and that there was no version of the calculation she could run that had produced an obvious reason, and yet the thing had happened anyway. This was not a sensation she recognized. It was not entirely unwelcome. The fire burned lower. She did not move. She was still sitting in the same chair when it went out. The Hogsmeade visit fell on the first Saturday of December, and Narcissa came. She had told no one. She had arranged to be in the village at the hour when the students were most likely to be out, and she had stood at the far end of the high street, where the lane met the shops, and waited, with the patience she had learned from 6 months of waiting at the manor, and she had seen him come out of a shop with 2 other students she did not look at long enough to identify. The sight of him had gone through her like cold water. He was thinner than October. She had not thought there was room to be thinner than October. His face, which she had been watching since he was old enough to have a face worth watching, had the grey quality of something under sustained pressure, the eyes not quite attending to what they were directed at, the shoulders carrying the weight she had been watching him carry all year in the form of the reports that told her he was present and nothing more. He was talking to the students he was with. His face made the shapes of talking. She watched him from the end of the street until he and the others moved in the direction of the 3 broomsticks, and then she didn't follow. She had seen what she had come to see. He was still here. He was still moving through the world. This was not comfort. She had learned, in the past months, to be precise about the difference between information and comfort. But it was the thing she had come for, and she had it. She turned into the lane that ran alongside the post office. Molly Weasley was at the other end of it. Neither woman had arranged this. They both stopped. The lane was narrow and cold, the December light coming flat off the grey stone walls on either side, the ground still showing the frost from the night before in the places where the sun had not reached. Narcissa looked at Molly Weasley, and Molly Weasley looked at Narcissa, and the absence of surprise in this encounter had a quality that she would have found interesting if she had not been occupied with the encounter itself. She waited. The cold was immediate and real. She heard the distant sound of students somewhere in the main street, the particular layered noise of a village functioning on a weekend, and then that sound receded, and there was only the lane. Molly had come to Hogsmeade on order business that could not be handled by Owl, something that brought her near the school and required a specific conversation and no particular urgency once the conversation was done. She had done what she'd come to do. She was walking back through the village in the cold when she had seen Narcissa Malfoy standing at the end of the high street, very still, watching something at a distance. She had known, without confirming it, what she was watching. She had looked briefly in the direction of the 3 broomsticks and seen a pale boy moving away through the crowd, and she had not let herself look long enough for it to become more than a glance, and she had kept walking. She had been carrying the November owl for 6 weeks. The almost certainty of it had been with her since the morning the grey owl had arrived. The precise, small handwriting, the quality of the information itself, which was exactly as specific and exactly as actionable as a warning written by someone who was not accustomed to writing warnings and had written it anyway, from somewhere inside a world she had spent 15 years categorizing as simply and entirely the enemy. She had been carrying the almost certainty the way she carried things she could not yet do anything with, present and heavy and patient. When she turned into the lane and Narcissa Malfoy was at the other end of it, she did not stop walking until she was 4 feet away. The lane was empty. The stone walls were the color of old cloud. She looked at the composed face, the face that had been composing itself through difficult rooms for the whole of its adult life, she thought. The face that did not do anything more than it meant to do. And the almost certainty settled into something that was no longer almost. "I know the kind of person," she said, "who sent that owl in November." Narcissa said nothing. She did not look away. "What do you want from this?" "Nothing." The word came out flat and unadorned, and there was a pause after it that had the quality of someone finding the rest of the sentence. "I needed you to not lose something you didn't know was threatened. That was all I wanted." The silence that followed was the silence of a cold lane in December. It had no particular quality, except that it persisted, and neither of them broke it immediately. Molly looked at the wall beside her, at the frost still caught in the crevice where the stone met the ground. "I had 2 brothers," she said, "until I didn't. The war took them 1 autumn, and I've been counting autumns since." She paused. She did not look at Narcissa's face while she said this. "They're in Dumbledore's notes. I found that in October. Their names in his handwriting, with the dates. A line added later about keeping the record, because someone should." She stopped. "I hadn't known he'd done that." Narcissa was still. "I know what happened to them." Not an apology, not a gesture toward one. Something smaller and more precise. The acknowledgement of a woman who had been, for most of her adult life, inside a world in which deaths of that kind had been recorded as outcomes and filed away, and who could not stand in a lane in December and pretend to this woman's face that she had been unaware of the recording. "I know what it was. I won't pretend otherwise." Molly looked at her. "My son will not survive this war," Narcissa said. "Not the way things are. I know you don't believe me when I say I grieve what the First War took. You have no reason to believe me, and I'm not asking you to." She stopped for a moment. The cold pressed in. "He is 16 years old. I have been watching from a window since June, and I cannot watch from a window anymore. I don't know how to change what is coming. I only know I cannot do nothing." The lane held them both. "That is not enough," Molly said. "It is also not nothing." Neither of them moved for a moment longer. A group of students went past the far end of the lane, audible and then gone. The December light was flat and gave no warmth. Narcissa turned and walked back the way she had come. Molly stood in the lane. 5 minutes. The whole encounter. Less, perhaps. She looked at where Narcissa had been standing and thought about what had just been said to her, and what she had said in return, and whether either of it was enough. It was not enough. That was what she had said. That was also true. She thought about the precise, small handwriting on the November note, which she had folded and kept in a drawer that no one opened, because she had not known what else to do with it. She thought about the face of a woman who had stood in a corridor in October and looked at her directly, without the performance of hatred that would have been easier, and had not looked away. She was not going to forgive anyone. She was not going to revise the ledger of the last 15 years into something that exonerated any part of what the other side had done. She was not made for that, and she did not intend to become someone who was. But she had been wrong about one piece of it. She had said so to Arthur, in November, in the kitchen, in almost those words. A woman who was a category had become a face. A face had sent an unsigned warning. The warning had been precise, and the information had been accurate, and someone who had no reason to send it had sent it anyway. This was, however small, a thing that had happened in the world. She walked back out to the high street and went about what remained of her day. December came to Wiltshire in the way December always came, not with drama, but with the gradual withdrawal of light, the sky lowering itself toward the ground until the grounds and the sky were almost the same grey, and the house settling deeper into itself with each week that passed. Narcissa had stopped expecting Lucius's footstep in the hall. She had stopped expecting a great many things in the months since June. She had learned, in the way you learned things that were not lessons so much as adjustments, to live inside what was still there rather than beside what was absent. Draco was still at Hogwarts. She knew this from the letter she had received that week. 2 lines, the minimum, the handwriting not as careful as it usually was, which told her he was tired. He was attending classes. He was occupied with matters she was not going to ask about in writing. He was alive. She had read the note 3 times in the way she read all his notes now, not for what they contained, but for what they did not contain, the gaps in them being more informative than the sentences. He was alive. He had written his mother 2 lines. This was the whole of it, and she held it for a long time before she put it down. Bellatrix had been at the manor twice this week. The second visit had carried the particular quality of surveillance, the careful questions, the watching, the way she had looked at Narcissa, with the expression of a woman who suspected something she could not name. Narcissa had answered everything in the flat, steady register she used for everything she wanted to conceal. She was practiced at it. She had been practicing it for years. What had changed was not visible from the outside. She thought, in the evenings when the drawing room was quiet and there was nothing she had to be managing, about a woman she could not discuss with anyone in her life. She thought about Molly Weasley in a corridor in October, hardening around the eyes at what she saw. And then, later, in the same day, in a room where neither of them was supposed to be, going very still over a page. She thought about 2 words written in a round, practical hand and sent back on an undistinguished grey owl in the dark. She thought about a cold lane in December, and a voice that had said, "It is also not nothing," in the tone of someone who had meant both parts of it, with equal exactness. She had spent 15 years thinking of the Weasley family as a category. She did not have that anymore. She had a face. She had a woman who had stood in a lane and been told that a 16-year-old boy's mother could no longer watch from a window, and who had answered with the most precise possible response to that statement, which was that it was not enough, and it was also not nothing. This was the only kind of honesty Narcissa had ever found she could trust, the kind that did not pretend it was more than it was. She looked out at the grey December sky. She thought about a clock she had never seen, in a house she had never visited, that showed 9 hands, and told you where every person you loved was pointing at any given moment. She had read about the clock somewhere. order intelligence, years ago, a detail that had lodged without her meaning to keep it. She had not thought about it since. She thought about it now, what it would mean to have her son on a clock, to know, at any hour, which direction he was pointing. She did not have that. She had notes written in tired handwriting, and she had the knowledge she had gathered from Dumbledore's office in October, and she had whatever Snape was and wasn't telling her, and she had the particular kind of not knowing that had always felt, to her, like failure. She allowed it now to feel like something else. Not peace. Nothing as large as peace. But something fractionally different from failure. The possibility that not knowing could be, in some limited configuration, the same as trust. That she could hold her son at the end of an owl's flight and know he was attending classes and writing her 2-line letters and simply allow that to be sufficient. That the wanting she felt, the specific wanting, not for survival, not for the absence of disaster, but for Draco to have a future that contained something besides endurance, was a want she was now able to hold without putting it down. She kept it. For the first time in a very long time, she kept it. Ron's letter arrived at the Burrow on a Thursday morning, carried by the school owl who always looked slightly affronted by the Devon weather. Molly read it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her. The letter was 2 pages of complaints about a transfiguration essay and a detailed account of a Quidditch match in which Ron appeared to have saved 3 goals through what he described as exceptional skill and what she suspected was luck. And at the bottom, in the closing lines, the small news. Hermione had found a book he'd been looking for. The heating charms in the dormitory were working again. He was fine. He was fine. The letter had the quality all his letters had. Not eloquent, not brief, but thoroughly Ron in the way that only Ron could be, which was the whole of what she had ever asked of it. She set it down on the kitchen table and put both hands around her mug. She thought about what it would mean to receive a letter from a 16-year-old that told you nothing. Not nothing in the way of Ron's letters, which were nothing in the sense of no disasters, but nothing in the sense of having been written by someone who could not tell you what was actually happening, because what was actually happening was not something that could be written. She thought about reading the gaps in it. She thought about holding a letter for a long time, not for the words, but for the confirmation that someone had held a quill. She had no way to name, to Arthur or anyone else, the woman she was thinking of. She had no way to explain what she knew or how she knew it, and she was not certain, if she had the words, that she would use them yet. The warning in November had not come with an obligation. She had not been asked to do anything with it except act on it, which she had done, and perhaps keep it, which she had also done. The note was in the kitchen drawer under the unused candles, in the place where things went that she intended to deal with when she knew what dealing with them meant. She thought about Ginny. Her daughter was 15 years old, in her 5th year, at the school that was, according to what she had read in Dumbledore's office, also the only safe place for a boy who was 1 year older than her. 1 year. She thought about Ginny's handwriting, looping and decisive, never uncertain about what it was doing. And then she tried to imagine watching that handwriting change over a term into something tired and minimal, and not being able to ask why, and having no window into whatever the tired and minimal handwriting meant. She could not quite do it. She tried, and the trying did not produce the full thing, only the shape of it. Enough to be uncomfortable, enough to know that the shape was real. She looked at the clock. 9 hands, December 1996, and all 9 pointing somewhere she knew. Arthur at work, Ron at school, Ginny at school, the others at their respective locations, Percy's hand at work, which was still not a location and was still the most she knew, and was likely the most she was going to know for some time, and she let herself look at it for a moment without flinching, and then she let herself look at Ron's hand and Ginny's hand, both of them pointing to Hogwarts, both of them findable, all alive, all located, all pointing somewhere. She breathed. She was not going to become someone who forgave things that shouldn't be forgiven. She was not going to pretend that a warning, however accurate and however well-timed, had undone 15 years of a war and everything the war had done. She knew what the ledger contained, and she was not revising it. But there was something that was not on the ledger, and that she was also not going to pretend didn't exist. A woman who had looked at her directly in a corridor in October, without performance, and not looked away. A woman who had been watching from a window for 6 months, and had said, in a cold lane, that she could not do it any more. Who had owed her nothing, and given her something real. This was not friendship. It was not alliance. It was not anything she had a name for. It was one less wall than there had been in October. She picked up Ron's letter and read it again from the beginning, in the warm kitchen